He thought he was hiring a cook. What arrived at his ranch wasn't just a woman with children. It was a fracture in the system that governed the town, the law, and even his own mind. A single widow, 3 silent children, and a winter that never forgives mistakes. But the real storm wasn't outside. It was the quiet rules no one dared to break, about family, control, and who gets to belong. Tonight, I'm going to show you how one decision, one open door, triggered fear, surveillance, and a hidden power struggle that changed everything. Stay with me, because once you see how systems react to kindness, you'll never look at history, or your own life, the same way again. They thought he was just a lonely rancher looking for a cook. But what walked up that frozen road was not a job applicant. It was a fracture in reality, an event that would quietly rewrite every rule of belonging, power, and survival in that valley. Listen closely. Stories like this aren't about kindness. They're about systems breaking when one unpredictable variable enters the equation. Jonas lived in a world designed for isolation. Rural towns, especially in harsh frontiers, evolved like closed ecosystems. Outsiders weren't welcomed. They were tested, filtered, and often quietly erased through gossip, cold shoulders, and institutional neglect. This was psychological control long before anyone named it. Small communities enforcing obedience through exclusion. So when Clara Dawson arrived, widowed, poor, dragging 3 children through snow, she wasn't just a woman asking for work. She was a destabilizing force, a living contradiction to the myth that suffering must be endured in silence. Notice the symbolism. Winter, silence, a man alone for years. The land itself had conditioned Jonas to accept solitude as destiny. That's how systems train individuals, by normalizing deprivation until loneliness feels like virtue. Then she crossed his threshold. In older frontier societies, a household was power. Whoever controlled warmth, food, and shelter controlled survival. By allowing Clara and her children inside, Jonas unknowingly disrupted the local hierarchy. He introduced emotional and biological continuity into a space meant to stay sterile, and the town noticed. Rumors began immediately, notes pinned to posts, quiet visits from co-op men who weren't there to help, only to observe. Surveillance doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears frost on its hat brim and curiosity in its eyes. Clara's presence wasn't just personal. It threatened the town's invisible contract. Outsiders stay out and those inside don't change. But she did more than change Jonas's routine. She reactivated dormant memories in him, his sister, warmth, bread, shared meals. This is how forbidden truths spread, not through speeches, but through reawakening what systems work to numb. And here's the uncomfortable part. Kindness itself can be a form of rebellion when a system is built on emotional scarcity. By opening his door, Jonas didn't just shelter a widow. He reopened a human pattern that frontier culture had spent decades suppressing, and the town would not let that happen without testing the limits. Because when one man breaks the script, the system must respond or lose control. And the real story begins when control feels threatened. The first sign of resistance is never violence, it's attention. When the co-op man lingered on Jonas's porch, when the unsigned note warned him to be careful who you bring into town, that wasn't neighborly concern. That was a psychological perimeter forming around a perceived anomaly. Frontier towns historically operated like microstates, no police force, no centralized power, just collective pressure. If you deviated, the community didn't arrest you. It isolated you economically and socially until survival became impossible. This was soft power before soft power had a name. Clara sensed it immediately. Trauma sharpens perception. Widows, migrants, abused women, these people learn to read micro-threats in tone, posture, silence. When she folded that warning note without trembling, that wasn't indifference. That was experience with systems that punish vulnerability. She had already lived inside one. Her marriage had been a private institution with its own laws, punishments, and propaganda. He was sick with grief. Winter made him drink. These are narratives societies use to excuse controlled violence. They shift responsibility away from the system and onto circumstance. Clara rejected that narrative. Family doesn't bruise, family doesn't terrorize. Those words are dangerous in any era because they expose a foundational lie that suffering within sanctioned structures is normal, acceptable, even sacred. Whether it's a household, a church, a town, or a state, the pattern is the same. Pain is reframed as duty. Jonas didn't fully understand this yet, but his instincts did. When he chose to house her family, he positioned himself against the town's invisible governance. He became a node of resistance, without ideology, without intention. And then the gifts arrived. Biscuits, preserves, bread, a note from the pastor, kindness wrapped in scarcity. This is how systems test boundaries. They offer controlled compassion to gauge whether the anomaly will assimilate or escalate. Pastor Weller's gift wasn't just generosity, it was a signal. We see you. We are watching. Choose your path. Clara's reaction, gratitude mixed with disbelief, reveals something deeper. When kindness is rare, it becomes destabilizing. It fractures identity. You start to wonder whether you deserve safety, whether warmth is a trap. And then came the rider, a man on horseback watching from the storm, not approaching, not leaving, surveillance without contact. In intelligence, this is called presence signaling, letting a target know they're seen without revealing motive. Fear thrives in ambiguity. Jonas felt it, a cold that wasn't weather. This is how control escalates. Observation, signaling, narrative shaping. Violence comes last, if needed. The town had not yet decided what Clara represented, but Winter had already delivered the message. Outsiders are variables. Variables are threats, and threats must be contained. Jonas thought he had invited warmth into his house. He had actually invited a confrontation with the architecture of social power, and power never reveals itself until you challenge it. Control systems reveal themselves most clearly when they feel exposed, and exposure arrived on Jonas's porch with a lantern and a man who should not have existed. Elias Marin, the brother. The emissary of a past Clara had buried under snow and silence. When he said, "Her husband sent me," reality cracked. Because Clara's story, the widowed mother fleeing hunger, wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole architecture of truth. Systems survive on partial truths. They allowed just enough honesty to function without collapsing. Her husband wasn't dead. He was broken, violent, searching. And suddenly, the town's suspicions gained a legal and moral dimension. In that era, a woman leaving her husband could be framed as abandonment, theft of children, even criminal defiance of patriarchal law. The institution of marriage was not just personal, it was state-sanctioned governance inside the home. Clara didn't just escape a man, she escaped a jurisdiction. Elias represented the system's attempt to reclaim jurisdiction. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't violent. That's what makes him more dangerous. He carried the language of duty, kinship, legality. He spoke like a clerk of destiny, not a villain. He's sober now. He knows what he did. They belong with family. Listen to those phrases. They are not personal. They are institutional. They echo through centuries of legal doctrine, religious sermons, and social contracts. They prioritize structure over suffering, order over justice. Clara's response was revolutionary. Family doesn't bruise. That sentence dismantles entire civilizations built on tolerated harm. It reframes authority as conditional, not absolute. It implies that legitimacy comes from care, not blood or law. Jonas understood this instinctively. When he said, "She's safe in my home," law or no law, he wasn't just protecting her. He was asserting an alternate sovereignty. His ranch became a microstate with its own values, its own laws, its own moral constitution. This is how revolutions begin, not with crowds, but with a single household refusing to comply. Elias recognized it. That's why he backed away. He saw the architecture of defiance forming. Not loud, not ideological, just unyielding. He promised to tell his brother Clara was alive. He promised to try to stop him. Notice the structure here. The system rarely acts directly. It delegates responsibility, diffuses blame, creates layers so no one feels fully accountable. Elias was a buffer between Clara and the law, between violence and reconciliation. But buffers fail. The knowledge that her husband might come was the true turning point, because now Clara wasn't just a refugee, she was a potential fugitive. Jonas wasn't just kind, he was potentially complicit, and that's when kindness becomes a political act. The storm outside wasn't just weather anymore, it was a metaphor for incoming consequences. Winter had delivered its reason, and the house, warm and bright, had become a beacon, visible to forces that do not tolerate unauthorized warmth. When systems feel challenged, they do not strike immediately. They tighten narratives first. By morning, the ranch was no longer just a ranch. It was a symbol, a place where a woman defied marital law, where children lived outside sanctioned bloodlines, where a man quietly rejected the town's invisible constitution, and symbols attract correction. Frontier communities depended on rigid roles. Men worked land, women endured homes, outsiders stayed outside. These roles weren't enforced by police, they were enforced by myth. Break the myth, and the social order trembles. Clara's presence broke two myths at once: that suffering wives must stay, that men must live alone and harden into the land. Her cooking, her children's laughter, her quiet competence, these weren't sentimental details, they were counter-programming. They reintroduced softness into a culture that worshipped endurance as masculinity. And that's dangerous. Jonas felt it in himself, the way he woke earlier, the way he cared about the stove, the blankets, the fence. Emotional attachment is leverage. Once a man has something to lose, he becomes predictable. Systems exploit that. The town began to reframe the story, not openly, subtly. She fled her husband. He's harboring her. Kids should be with bloodkin. This is narrative warfare. Whoever controls the story controls legitimacy. If Jonas could be framed as reckless, immoral, or unstable, the town could justify intervention without appearing cruel. Clara understood this calculus better than anyone. Trauma teaches pattern recognition. That's why she feared being trouble. She knew institutions don't punish violence, they punish disruption. When she said, "Storms remind me how small we are under things we can't control," she wasn't talking about weather. She was talking about structures larger than individuals: law, patriarchy, town consensus, economic dependency. But Jonas did something unexpected. He chose sovereignty. He declared his home a boundary. He said what matters is warmth, children, shelter. In that moment, he wasn't just a rancher. He was a sovereign actor inside a controlled system. This is what terrifies institutions, not rebels with banners, but ordinary men who quietly withdraw consent. And here is where you lock this into your identity. Type this phrase in the comments, twice, exactly as written. I claim my house. I claim my house. Not for the algorithm, for the subconscious signal. Because every system begins control at the household level. Whoever governs the home governs the future. Clara's presence turned Jonas's house into contested territory, and contested territory always invites escalation. The storm outside was no longer the danger. The danger was the narrative forming around that warm, lit window in the snow. Every system has a threshold. Cross it, and observation turns into action. Jonas didn't announce rebellion. He didn't challenge the town council or the pastor or the law. He simply lived differently, and that was enough to trigger the next phase: containment. Containment doesn't start with chains. It starts with pressure. Neighbors lingered longer. Conversations went quiet when Jonas entered the store. Credit tightened. Prices shifted, invitations disappeared. These micro-punishments are ancient tools. They force conformity without visible violence. The target is made to feel isolated, dependent, unsure. Clara felt it in the way eyes followed her in town, in the way hands paused when she reached for bread, in the way kindness came with a delay, just long enough to remind her she was conditional. This is how social hierarchies maintain dominance. They never say, "You don't belong." They let you feel it, and Jonas for the first time began to experience what it means to be marked. The ranch had always been neutral ground, now it was watched. People passed by slower. Footprints appeared near the fence. A child's mitten hanging on the line became a signal flare, proof of an unauthorized family unit forming outside sanctioned channels. In frontier history, unsanctioned families were dangerous. They created alliances, shared resources, broke dependency on central hubs. A man with a functioning household doesn't beg the town. He becomes resilient. Resilience is the enemy of centralized control. Clara's skills, cooking, mending, organizing, were not domestic trivia. They were infrastructure. She was rebuilding a microeconomy inside Jonas's home. Bread, warmth, rhythm, laughter. Systems fear rhythm. Rhythm creates stability. Stability creates independence. Jonas started stacking wood differently, planning meals, thinking beyond winter. He was no longer a man surviving the present. He was a man imagining the future. And imagination is revolutionary. But imagination invites counterforce. Whispers reached Elias. Law could be invoked. Papers could be filed. Children could be reclaimed. A husband's rights could eclipse a woman's safety. The town didn't need to be cruel. It just needed to be procedural. Procedures erase empathy. Clara knew this. That's why her hands trembled at night, even when the fire was strong. She understood that systems do not attack love directly. They attack legality, morality, tradition. They turn warmth into liability. Jonas felt it when he checked the latch again, when he kept the rifle close, when footsteps in snow sounded different after midnight. This is the psychological transformation point. The moment a man realizes safety is not granted, it is defended. The ranch was no longer just shelter. It was a line in the snow. There is a moment in every man's life when comfort turns into territory, when warmth turns into something you are willing to defend. Jonas reached that moment the night he stayed awake with the rifle across his lap, listening to the house breathe. Before Clara, silence meant loneliness. After Clara, silence meant vigilance. This is how attachment rewires power dynamics. Systems prefer individuals detached, mobile, replaceable. Families create friction. Homes create borders. Children create stakes that cannot be negotiated with policy or gossip. Clara's children changed Jonas more than her presence ever could. When he watched their chests rise and fall in sleep, he wasn't seeing mouths to feed. He was seeing continuity, legacy, proof that life could be more than endurance, and that is precisely what centralized systems historically tried to control: reproduction, inheritance, domestic structure. Frontier towns wanted predictable units, male laborers, compliant wives, children aligned to sanctioned bloodlines. An unsanctioned household, especially one formed by choice, not blood, was an ideological infection. Jonas's house was now an ideological infection. Clara understood the stakes better than he did. When she whispered, "You're trembling," she wasn't comforting him. She was marking the shift. He was no longer a neutral actor. He was a guardian. Guardianship is political. Every civilization fears independent guardians, because guardians answer to conscience, not policy. The footsteps outside that night were not just a man in snow. They were proof that Jonas's home had entered the town's awareness map. Lanterns, silhouettes, strangers asking questions. This is how enforcement begins before official enforcement. And when Elias said the law could hear about her, he wasn't threatening violence. He was threatening paperwork. Paperwork has destroyed more lives than storms ever have. Legal identity is power. Whoever defines who belongs where, who owns whom, who is responsible for whom, controls reality. Clara had stepped outside her assigned legal identity: wife, dependent, property adjacent. Jonas had stepped outside his solitary labor unit, emotionally inert, compliant with tradition. Together they formed a unit the system did not design, and undesigned units are dangerous. The town's storm wasn't outside anymore. It was assembling quietly, sentence by sentence, rumor by rumor, policy by policy. Jonas felt it, not as fear, but as something older and more decisive. There is a point where awareness becomes irreversible. Once you see the architecture of control, you can never unsee it. Jonas crossed that point without reading a book, without hearing a speech. He crossed it sitting at a wooden table, listening to a stove breathe, feeling a woman's hand steady his own. The town believed power lived in consensus, tradition, and law. Jonas discovered power lived in the household. Clara's quiet revolution was not political. It was existential. She rebuilt a rhythm inside the ranch that no council meeting could replicate. Morning routines, shared meals, children's voices, small rituals that made life coherent. Coherence is dangerous. When a man's life becomes coherent, he stops being easily steered. He stops needing the town's approval to feel real. He stops trading obedience for belonging. That's why patriarchal systems historically controlled women's mobility, not out of cruelty alone, but out of strategic design. Whoever controls domestic order controls the psychological stability of men, and whoever controls men controls land, labor, and war. Clara, by choosing her own safety over her husband's authority, short-circuited that chain. Jonas, by choosing her family over the town's expectations, severed his dependency on communal validation. This is how power quietly shifts from institutions to individuals. The town sensed it. That's why the whispers sharpened. Why Elias carried the thread of legality like a knife wrapped in velvet. Why strangers appeared in storms. They weren't afraid of violence. They were afraid of precedent. If one woman could leave, if one man could choose differently, if one household could operate outside the script, then others might follow. And systems collapse not from rebellion, but from replication. Jonas's house was no longer just a refuge. It was a prototype of a life where law did not override empathy, where tradition did not override truth, where masculinity did not require isolation, and where family was defined by protection, not permission. That is forbidden architecture. The storm outside began to weaken, but something else strengthened. Jonas's identity, Clara's certainty, the children's sense of safety. Once safety becomes real, men become dangerous to control, because they no longer negotiate their core for approval, and the town knew it. They could feel the gravity shifting toward that warm house on the hill. One household at a time is how empires decay. Power systems rarely fall in dramatic flames. They erode quietly. When ordinary people stop playing their assigned roles. Jonas never declared independence. Clara never filed a manifesto. The children never knew they were part of something subversive. And yet, together, they created the most destabilizing force a rigid society can face. A functioning, chosen family. Frontier towns believed survival required hardness, suspicion, and hierarchy. Jonas's home proved something else. Survival could be built on cooperation, warmth, and voluntary loyalty. That revelation is more dangerous than any rebellion, because rebellion can be crushed. But an alternative that works, that spreads. Imagine a neighbor noticing Jonas's fields thriving because he now had help. Imagine another lonely rancher wondering what life would be like with shared meals instead of silence. Imagine a woman in town quietly realizing she could leave too. This is how forbidden ideas propagate, not through speeches but through visible proof. The town would continue to whisper. Officials might eventually intervene. Elias's brother might arrive. Law might be invoked. Conflict might come. History is rarely kind to anomalies. But something irreversible had already happened. Jonas had tasted belonging that was not mediated by tradition. Clara had experienced safety not enforced by fear. The children had learned that family could be chosen, not endured. And once a man learns he can choose his world, he becomes immune to the oldest form of control, inevitability. Every empire, every institution, every town survives by convincing individuals that their roles are fixed. Jonas and Clara proved roles can be rewritten in a single winter. That's the real dark history here. Not violence, not storms, not law. But the quiet, subversive truth that a single household, warm, defiant, and self-governed, can undermine centuries of invisible control. And once you understand that, you start seeing systems everywhere. In cities, in relationships, in laws that define belonging. So the question isn't what happened to Jonas and Clara after winter broke. The question is this: what happens when you decide your house is sovereign? Because history doesn't change through speeches. It changes when someone opens a door and refuses to close it again. Winter did break, but not the way storms usually do. It didn't vanish in a single day. It receded, slowly, reluctantly, as if even the season sensed something in that house it could no longer control. Snow thinned, wind softened, the valley exhaled, and the ranch remained. Jonas stood on the porch one morning, sunlight cutting across the fields for the first time in weeks. Clara was behind him, May laughing as she chased a patch of melting ice, Tommy stacking wood with hands that had grown steadier. The house no longer felt like a shelter. It felt like a declaration. The town kept its distance. No one confronted him. No one apologized. Systems rarely admit change. But something shifted. The co-op man stopped lingering. Jeremiah's stares softened into neutrality. Pastor Weller nodded from across the road, as if acknowledging a boundary that had become permanent. They had tested the anomaly. It had not collapsed. Elias never returned. The husband never came. Whether he was stopped, lost, or broken beyond pursuit, Jonas never knew. History often leaves its threats unfinished, unresolved, just faded into rumor. But the fear never fully left. And that was the point. Because Jonas had changed. He understood now that safety is not permission granted by others. It is a perimeter built by those who decide to stand. Clara still woke before dawn, feeding the stove, watching the fire like it was a living guardian. She never forgot what she escaped, but she stopped looking over her shoulder every time the wind shifted. The children stopped whispering. They started planning. A bigger garden, a chicken coop, a school in town, a future. And that is how systems truly lose control, not through rebellion, but through continuity, through people who stop asking if they're allowed to exist and start acting like existence is already theirs. Jonas sometimes remembered the day the wagon appeared through the snow, how he thought he was hiring a cook, how he didn't realize he was hiring a new reality. He didn't save Clara, she didn't save him. They built something that neither winter nor tradition had planned for, and the town, quiet, rigid, ancient, had to adapt to a house that refused to freeze. That is the ending history rarely records. Not a gunshot, not a speech, not a battle. Just a door that stayed open, and a man who decided no system, no rumor, no law would make him close it again. Because sometimes the most dangerous act in history is choosing to keep the fire burning. This story is based on historical events and folklore, but some details have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. Names, locations, and conversations may have been altered to protect privacy and enhance narrative impact. The events depicted explore sensitive topics, including loss, conflict, and social pressure. Viewer discretion is advised. This content is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, medical, or professional advice.